is not enjoyable, but a topic I feel very strongly and very passionately about. Before I start, I'd like to say to all of you, I welcome your questions, but I'd like to ask that you hold your questions until I finish my presentation. So if a question comes to mind as I'm speaking with you this morning, try to remember it. And when I am finished, I hope you'll have some questions to ask. I am here today to bear witness to the Holocaust, to acknowledge and honor those individuals and their families who risked their lives to save the lives of people like myself, and to share my story with you. And I would like to begin by asking each of you to think about your lives as they are today. I'd like for you to think about your lives with your families, with your spouses, with your children or grandchildren, and any other member of your family. I'd like for you to think about your lives in terms of your careers or your businesses or being in retirement. I'd like for you to think about your lives in terms of how and where you worship. I'd like for you to think about your lives in terms of the friends you have and the time you spend with them. And having done that for just a few seconds, I now would like for you to imagine the following things happening to you. I'd like you to imagine that several months ago a new government came to power in our country, not by being elected, but by seizing complete control and power. That since that time you have seen and you have witnessed dramatic negative changes take place. You have seen certain music being banned, certain books being banned, and then thousands and thousands of those books set on fire. Those of you who have careers, you've been demoted or have lost your careers. Those of you who have businesses, your business has been vandalized and then firebombed and destroyed. Your place of worship likewise has been vandalized and then firebombed and destroyed. Friends of yours have disappeared overnight without a trace. You and members of your family have been physically attacked and beaten in the streets, and most of the population has stood by and let it happen. Imagine now some time has passed, and that one night you are awakened out of a deep sleep by some loud noise and commotion outside your home. Then there is a loud knock on your front door. You get up and you answer that knock, and you are faced and confronted by several individuals with guns pointed at you. And you are told to awaken the rest of your family, gather only those things you can carry, and that you have just a few minutes to leave your home. You ask them why. And you are told in no uncertain terms to simply do as you are told. So you do awaken the rest of your family, begin to gather items that are important to you, clothes and other things. And as you walk out the front door and adjust to the darkness outside, what you see are some trucks parked in front of your home and up and down your street. You see people like yourselves, children and babies, being forced on the back of those trucks. Unfortunately, you also see and you witness some individuals who try to resist. And you see them shot and killed in front of your eyes. So you and your family get on the back of one of those trucks. You are tired, you are angry, you are confused. And you have no idea as to what's going to happen to all of you next. But you find out in a few minutes. Because as those trucks leave the front of your home and leave your street and leave your neighborhood, they drive to the nearest railroad station. And when they get there, they drive up to a very long freight train. And now you and all the others are forced, like animals, to get into freight boxcars. As you step into your freight boxcar, you can see there is very little food, there is very little water, there are no sanitary facilities of any kind. And a freight boxcar that might hold 50 or 75 people is now crammed full with nearly 200 of you. You cannot sit down, you cannot lie down, you're forced to stand. The doors to your boxcar close and the train begins to move. It is very dark, it is very cold, it is very uncomfortable. And what you hear for the next 3 days is the cries of babies and the hysteria of some of your fellow adults. When the train finally stops and the doors to your boxcar open and you look outside for the first time in 3 days, what you see is some barren ground and some wooden buildings surrounded by high barbed wire fences. The mountains to the west you're used to seeing every day now are gone. You have no idea where you are. And once again, like animals, you are taken out of the freight boxcar that you're in, and you are marched into one of those wooden buildings. As you walk in, you can see there is very little furniture, there are very few beds, there is mostly straw on the floor. You live in this place and you survive in this place for the next 20 to 24 months. And during that time, you live on just 2 meals per day that for the most part consist of a watery soup and some bread. You see many people get sick, many of them die. But somehow, some way, you and your family do manage to survive. And then I want you to imagine, for those of you who are parents or grandparents of young children, that you are faced with a very difficult decision to make. Because there are some individuals who have come to this place whose main purpose, whose main mission, whose main goal is to rescue and save as many children and babies from this place. And the decision you have to make as a parent or grandparent is whether or not to give your young child or young children to them. Now, before I go on, the question is, did this really happen? And the answer is yes. Did this happen to a small number of people, like 50 or 100 or maybe 1,000 people? And the answer is no. This happened to millions and millions of people a long time ago, between 1935 and 1945. And then we have to ask the questions, why did this happen and how could this happen? And to answer those questions, I've got to take you way back to the end of World War I. Germany lost World War I very badly, and because of that, conditions in Germany were pretty awful. People were angry and upset. The economy was in shambles, inflation was very high, unemployment was very high. People had a very difficult time getting enough money together to buy food and clothes and other necessities. And along came a very evil young man by the name of Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler had some very strong ideas about how to solve and take care of all of Germany's troubles and problems. His ideas centered on and focused on getting rid of and eliminating all minority groups all over Germany, mainly the Jews. So he began to make very hateful, very evil speeches. Speeches that promoted discrimination, bigotry, hatred, and violence. And in the beginning, very few people listened. The crowds were very, very small. And as a matter of fact, Adolf Hitler was even arrested and put in jail because he himself got involved in violence. During the time he spent in jail, Adolf Hitler wrote a book. The book was called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. And in that book he wrote about and he outlined what he would do if he ever came to power in Germany. When he got out of jail, he went back to making those hateful, evil speeches. And unfortunately, little by little, the crowds began to grow. People began to believe in what he said. And then he formed the Nazi Party, along with 6 other evil men. A very small group of 7 people. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because those 7 evil men grew in numbers to be hundreds, and then thousands, and eventually millions of Nazis. And in less than 20 years, they had created and caused what we know today to be the Holocaust, which turned out to be the killing of more than 11 million innocent people. 11 million innocent people. Now that's a very, very large number, but if you could try to think about or possibly imagine, every one of us living in the state of Colorado today, every man, every woman, every child, every baby living in our state today, and if all of us were to die tomorrow, more than twice as many people died in the Holocaust as live in the whole state of Colorado today. Now, I said the Nazi Party began to grow in numbers. In the beginning, they also did run in local and state and national elections. In 1932, the Nazi Party got 30% of the vote in Germany. Less than half, not a majority. A man by the name of Hindenburg was elected president. President Hindenburg was not a Nazi, but he was 85 years old and in very bad health. On January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg made a very fatal mistake. He appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany, which gave Adolf Hitler, the Nazi Party, unlimited powers. And then in August of 1934, President Hindenburg died. And Adolf Hitler, the Nazi Party, seized complete control and power in Germany. And those things I mentioned to you a few moments ago began to happen. People like yourselves lost the right to vote, lost jobs, careers, businesses. People were physically attacked and beaten in the streets. And most of the German population just stood by and let it happen. And then a major event took place all over Germany on the night of November 9th and 10th, 1938. The event was called Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass. On that night, several thousand homes, several hundred businesses, several hundred synagogues were firebombed and destroyed. Thousands of people were injured. Hundreds were killed. And this time the world stood by and let it happen. So why am I here this morning talking about this, and what have I got to do with any of this? Well, let me say it to you, I speak to groups like yours quite often. Although most of the time I speak with middle school and high school students, because they are the future of our country. And I do that because there are individuals and organizations in our world today, some in our own country, some in our own state, some in our own communities, who are trying to rewrite history, who would deny the Holocaust ever happened. And I'm here to say to you, it did happen. And as a very young child, I was there. I was born March 29th, 1938, in Mannheim, Germany, a very large city in the southern part of Germany. I had a younger sister born June the 4th of 1940, and it's a miracle she was even born because of the conditions that existed for Jews in Germany at that time. On October 22nd, 1940, my family got the knock on the front door I described to you a few minutes ago. My 4.5-month-old sister, my mother, my father, and I, along with hundreds of other Jews, were taken out of our home, then taken by truck to the nearby railroad station, then taken by freight train from Mannheim, Germany, to the southern part of France, to a place called Camp Gurs. Now, why France? Well, as you may recall from your World War II history, the Nazis conquered and occupied France in early 1940. And as a result, the French government, called the Vichy government, chose to assist, cooperate, and collaborate with the Nazis. And one of the things the French government did was to build a large number of holding and detention camps all over France. Places for people like us to be taken to until the Nazis could decide what to do with us next. So my family arrived by freight train at Camp Gurs on October 25th, 1940. The first winter we were there were 12,000 men, women, children, and babies in this one holding camp alone. Of those 12,000 people that very first winter, more than 1,000 died of starvation, disease, or froze to death. Somehow, some way, my parents were able to keep us alive. And I have to say to you, I have no idea how my mother kept my 4.5-month-old sister alive, but she did. We lived there, we survived there until August of 1942. Now, I said the French government chose to assist, cooperate, and collaborate with the Nazis. But there were hundreds and hundreds of French people who chose to do things differently, who chose a higher road, who chose a higher goal, who chose to risk their lives by joining an organization called the French Resistance. And one of the goals, one of the purposes, one of the missions of the French Resistance was to rescue and save as many children and babies from these holding camps. To do that, they first had to find a way to infiltrate those camps. And what they did was to pose as workers. Once they got inside those camps, they then had the much more difficult task of trying to convince people like my parents to give up their children to them to be rescued. So in August of 1942, my parents had a very difficult, a very terrible decision to make. They could choose to keep my young sister and I with them to see what would happen to all of us next. Or they could choose to give us up to complete strangers, not knowing what would happen to us, not knowing if they'd ever see us again, but hoping if they made the choice to give us up, that we'd be better off. My parents made the choice to give us up. And then the question is, did they make the right decision? And the answer is a very definite and emphatic yes. Because if they had not done that, I would not be here this morning, I would not be alive today, to talk about it. And the reason for that is that less than 1 month later, on September the 16th, 1942 to be exact, my parents, along with hundreds of others, including some children, some babies who were not given up and therefore not rescued, were put on another freight train. And this time the freight train took them from the southern part of France to Poland, to the Auschwitz concentration camp. One of the most horrendous, one of the most horrific of all the killing camps that existed all over Europe. And you have to realize, of course, that the concentration camps were not like the holding camps. In the holding camps, you had a chance to survive. In the concentration camps, the chance of surviving was very, very slim. As a matter of fact, less than 4%. Less than 4 out of 100. Less than 40 out of 1,000. And so on. The train my parents were on carried 1,003 people. Again, men, women, some children, some babies who had not been given up and therefore not rescued. It arrived at Auschwitz on September the 18th, 1942. By January 27th, 1945, when Auschwitz was liberated from just that one train alone, of those 1,003 people, only 38 were still alive. 965 had died from just that one train alone. Now you try to think about or imagine hundreds and hundreds of such trains arriving at different concentration camps all over Europe, all of the time, and you get some idea of where the 11 million innocent people comes from. As these trains arrived, one of the first things that people sometimes heard was a small band playing at the station, which is ridiculous and absurd, but true. The first thing that people saw when they got out of the freight boxcars this time were Nazi officers or doctors standing on a platform, pointing to the left or pointing to the right. Now, what did that mean? And let me say to you, this is difficult to talk about. It may be hard for some of you to hear, but because it happened and because it's true, I have to share it with you. If you were sent to the left, you were usually under the age of 12 or 13, or over the age of 55 or 60, or you looked to be in bad health, or you might have a physical handicap, or maybe, just maybe, the Nazi officer or doctor just didn't like your looks. If you were sent to the right, you were usually over the age of 12 or 13, under the age of 55 or 60, looked to be strong, looked to be healthy, looked to be able to do a very hard day's work. Now, this is the hard part. And remember that I, as a 4.5-year-old child, my sister, as a 2.5-year-old, were not on that train. If you were sent to the left by a Nazi doctor, what that meant was that you were going to have medical experiments performed on you without anesthetics. If you were sent to the left by a Nazi officer, it meant you would die that day. And the first thing that happened to you was all of your hair was shaved off, all of your clothes were taken away, and you were made to feel subhuman, just like an animal. And then they played a horrible trick on you by telling you to be sure and watch where your clothes were hung, so you came out of the showers when you did, you'd find your clothes. Only the showers were not showers. They were gas chambers. And instead of water coming out of the faucets, gas spewed out. And within minutes, people died a horrible, horrible death. If you were sent to the right, you were given a chance, at least for a while, to survive in Auschwitz. And if you were very lucky and you had some musical talent, you might even get a chance to play in that small band to welcome future trains. Which again is ridiculous and absurd, but true. Or you might get to be a seamstress or a carpenter or a janitor or some such job. But for most of those sent to the right, that is not what they had to do. They now lived on just one meal per day that for the most part consisted of a watery soup and some stale bread. The kinds of jobs they had to do were to dig mass graves, to pull the dead bodies out of the gas chambers and throw them in those graves, and much, much worse. The day the train arrived with my parents on it, my father was sent to the right and given a chance to survive in Auschwitz. And he turned out to be one of the 38 still alive on January 27, 1945. He lived through it, he survived it, he did whatever horrible, horrible things he had to do to make it. That same day, my mother, at the age of 29, was sent to the left. And she died that day. She had never committed a crime. She had never hurt anyone. She was killed because she was Jewish. Period. No other reason. Now let me go back and talk about what happened to me after I was rescued from Camp Gurs. In addition to all those very brave and courageous and heroic French people who were part of the French resistance, there were also hundreds of French families who chose to risk their lives by taking in Jewish kids like me and hiding them from the Nazis. I was taken in by a French Christian family, a family who didn't know me. They were Christian, I was Jewish. They had absolutely no reason to take the risk they did to save my life, but they did. They chose to hide me in their basement. And I lived in the basement of my French Christian rescue family from August of 1942 to the spring of 1944. I very seldom got to go outside. My French Christian rescue family took very good care of me. They fed me well, they made me as comfortable as they could, and they spent as much time as they could in that basement with me. But they had to be very, very careful so as not to attract the attention of the Nazis outside. They had to also convince me as a 4.5-year-old child to be as quiet and still most of the time. The house was never searched. Therefore, I was not discovered. Therefore, I lived, and I owe my life to my French Christian rescue family. By the spring of 1944, when the Nazis no longer occupied that part of France, I was reunited with my sister. I had not seen her in more than 1.5 years. She and I got back together in an orphanage outside of Paris, where we lived from the spring of 1944 to the fall of 1946. My father, who had survived Auschwitz and all of its horrors, had gone back to live in Germany. And he spent from the summer of 1945 to the fall of 1946, searching for us, tracing us, and yes, finding us in the orphanage outside of Paris. So in the fall of 1946, my sister and I were reunited with my father. He had survived Auschwitz, and physically he was okay. But as a person, he'd lost an awful lot. He never, ever spoke about his experiences or what he had to do to survive. He told us our mother had died. He would not talk about what happened to her. There were no pictures of the family around the house. And after just a few short months, because I think he realized that maybe he wasn't being the kind of father he wanted to be, he began to make plans for my sister and I, just the two of us, to come to America to a better life. And it has been a good life for us. We arrived in Colorado in the spring of 1950. In the beginning, we lived with my grandparents in Pueblo, Colorado. They and my mother's 5 brothers and sisters, my aunts and uncles, had gotten out of Germany in 1939. They promised us they would do all they could to get us out, which of course did not happen. So my sister and I lived with my grandparents for 3 years. They got too old to take care of us. They retired to New York. They sent my sister and I to Denver. My sister lived in 2 foster homes that did not work out for her. I lived in 1 foster home that did not work out for me. So we both wound up in an orphanage in West Denver, where we each lived until we graduated high school. I went on to University of Colorado in Boulder, graduated from there, started my career, got married, and raised a family. And for this morning, that's where I'd like to stop with my story. Before I ask for your questions, and I hope you'll have some questions to ask, I'd like to say one more thing. And that is, if you get nothing else out of my presentation this morning, I'd like you to remember that one very evil man, and then 6 others, a very small group of 7 people, were able to create and cause the Holocaust, which once again took the lives of more than 11 million innocent people. Of those 11 million, more than half, 6 million were Jews. But it's important to know and to realize that there were 5 million others. Those of other minority groups. Those who did try to resist Hitler. Those who took in Jewish kids like me and were discovered and sent to concentration camps to die. And now I welcome your questions. Yes, sir.
When you finally moved you and your sister moved into to Denver, and you became more and more independent and what have you, did you ever have an opportunity to try to communicate or get in touch with the people that took care of you in France?
Over the years, I indeed have searched and researched to try and find my French Christian rescue family, to thank them for what they did. And I've had a lot of help. With the help of the French consulate in San Francisco, we found a woman living in France in 1983 who had saved some children during World War II. The good news and the miracle is she turned out to be my sister's rescue mother. And my sister and she were reunited in Paris in 1983. The bad news is I've not found my rescue family, and that's a real loss in my life because I've not had a chance to thank them. Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, a couple. The Nazis obviously were known for keeping meticulous records.
Absolutely.
How did the two of you get, I understand you said the resistance took you in, but how did they get you out in the first place? In other words, the Nazis would have been counting. They would have known, in all probability, that you were missing, right?
Right.
At some point. So how do they do that? And the second part, which I think would be really interesting to know, I've never really heard too much about it, is how did they reunite, I can't talk this morning, reunite you and your sister and your father after the
Okay.
war?
Those two questions are pretty much related, and I'll get into the second one in a minute.
Okay.
In the beginning, what the French resistance was able to do is to bribe the Nazis in various ways. As time went along, they actually physically smuggled the very youngest and babies out of the camp, and of course never came back themselves. The second part, just like the Nazis, the French resistance and their organization kept accurate and detailed records of where children were, so that when the war was over, or when the Nazis no longer occupied that part of France, they had to convince people like my French Christian family to let the children go. And they reunited children in orphanages like the one my sister and I wound up in.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
This may come off as a bit racist, but following World War II, cognitive psychologists were absolutely fascinated by how the German people, and look at the culture, Goethe, Schiller, at the artistic side, Einstein on the scientific side, how did they become so enamored with an art school flunk out? Were they ready for it? And then what that produced in the world of cognitive psychology is a number of tests, one of which is tolerance of ambiguity. And what they did was administer them internationally. And they found that in these cognitive psychology tests, the Germans fell on the authoritarian side. Did you experience that or see that, or in any contacts with people of German ancestry since then?
Okay, what you're alluding to is several things. First of all, as I mentioned, conditions in Germany were really bad. And Adolf Hitler came in, who was very charismatic, and got the German people to be riled up and blame Jews and other minorities for the problems and the terrible things that were going on. Plus the fact that Germany, as you also alluded to, the whole atmosphere was such that it didn't happen overnight. The conditions were there much earlier than the 1920s and 1930s. Adolf Hitler simply brought it to the surface and was able to expand on it. Does that answer your question?
To a certain degree, the question is the gullibility, and obviously, the economic situation. I'm totally familiar with that. Thomas Keneally has written an excellent book on that topic. Keneally also Schindler's List, but I still am a little puzzled. You have this cultural base, and then you have this moronic,
It wasn't hard for Hitler to seize upon that. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
Way back.
Yeah, I apologize for my late intrusion, and I just want to genuinely thank you for coming here and
Sure.
sharing your story and speaking. Have you come to a place of acceptance with kind of what manifested, or have you able to even go beyond that and ask for forgiveness from anybody who, at the lower level, I understand, that there's like the hierarchy of the seven, but like in your father's situations, is that something you come to reconcile?
The best way I can answer that question is to say to you, I have no animosity, no resentment, no anger towards the German people today, especially those who are my age or even a little bit older. But there are people in Germany today, as there are in other places, who are in the late 80s, 90s, who still say nothing really happened. I got on a train in Munich several years ago to go to Dachau. And there was a very, very old woman sitting across from us. And she asked where I was going. And I told her I was going to Dachau to see the concentration camp. And she just said, nothing really happened there. That's the mentality of the very oldest Germans today. Other questions? Yes.
In view of your horrendous experience and what you saw of how people generally reacted, kind of standoffish, how do you view in our current country what has happened to include, a policy of physically separating children from parents and even demonizing groups of people? I
Mike,
know it's a political
Mike,
question. I can't help but imagine what it is.
I have to say, first of all, that there'll be some of you who disagree with what I'm going to say. And nothing that is going on in our country right now is going to lead to what happened in the 1930s in Germany. However, having said that, I'm appalled by what's going on. We have a president who repeatedly has stated that the press is the enemy of the people. We have a president who has brought into the White House people who are racist and anti-Semitic, like Stephen Miller. We have a president who, if anybody disagrees with him or challenges him, he will verbally attack them. I could go on, but I won't. So I'm very concerned. Now again, having said that, we have Congress, we have the US Senate, we have the Supreme Court, who will never ever let things get out of control. And our democracy will live. Yes.
When your father found you and your sister, did you go back and live in the part of Germany where your home was before?
No. He went back to where he grew up, to a very small town not far from Cologne, Germany, which is towards the north of Germany. Yes.
When you were at Camp Gurs, do you have a recollection of how many people were in the building that you were living in at that time?
No.
Okay.
No. At that point, I was only 2.5,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
no.
Did you have an area that you had to stay in when you were in that building with your family?
Based on my research, because at 2.5 I have no recollection of that, we were all together all the time.
Okay.
Yes.
When you were at the University of Colorado, did you get a chance to meet Professor Rosick? Were you there when he was there?
No, but I've heard about him.
He was from Poland.
Yes.
Escaped the...
Yes. I know his story fairly well.
Yeah, good.
Yes.
Yeah. Are you aware of Holocaust tourism?
Holocaust tourism?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Oh. Peter Matheson's, before he passed away, wrote about that, where you could go through the gates and so on and so forth. And when I read it, I was absolutely appalled, but...
Well, if I might expand on that, one of the things I wanted to do growing up in America was to go back and retrace my steps and my parents' steps. So I did that about 10 years ago. I went back to Mannheim, where I was born. I went back to Camp Gurs, which today exists as an overgrown forest. Because when de Gaulle came to power in Germany, he was so embarrassed by what the previous administration had done that he had these camps torn down and planted trees. I went back to the orphanage outside of Paris and spent some time there. And I wound up in Auschwitz, through the gate that says Arbeit macht frei.
Yes, that's part of it.
Yeah, and said a final goodbye to my mother. Yes, ma'am.
So, you obviously you were separated from your dad after y'all were reunited, and went to live with your grandparents, right? And then, were you able to reconnect with any other family over the course of the years?
My aunts and uncles to some extent. And that's another story, you know, you go through these things and you deal with things differently. My sister, when my grandparents sent us to Denver, my sister was really, really angry as to why one or more of my aunts and uncles didn't take us in. I accepted it, but she was really, really upset. All her life, actually. Yes, sir.
Your grandparents came over to the U.S. At what period of time did it become impossible for people to immigrate to the U.S.? And what was that process when they were allowed to? Was it a function of money? Was it easy? Was it hard? Walk me through that.
Okay. In regard to my grandparents, they were very fortunate because my grandfather had fought in World War I for Germany, had earned what's called the Iron Cross, a big whatever. He was able to trade that Iron Cross to the Nazis for them to be able to get visas to get out. In terms of when things got pretty much impossible, 1939, pretty much 1940, yeah. And again, you have certain things that you find out. You know, President Roosevelt was a great president, but he also had people in his administration who stopped some of the immigration that could have taken place. And it's well documented. Yes?
Once your sister and you came to the United States, did you have an opportunity to see your father at all after that?
Okay, when we first came to America, my sister and I corresponded by mail with my dad. He got remarried. We did lose contact with him. I happened to be back in Europe in 1970. I was able to look him up. I spent one evening with him. He then died of natural causes in 1975. My sister never saw him again from the day we came to America. Well, thank you very much for being here.
Eric, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And we wanted to give you one of our challenge coins,
Okay.
just as a remembrance and connection with our museum.
Nice. Thank you.
But thank you so much.
Sure.
And again, please stick around and talk with Eric some more, and visit the rest of the museum. Help us with our donut